Hi everyone, welcome back to the Soldiers of Cinema podcast, episode 32 today. I'm Colin McFader. I'm joined as always by Clark Coffey. How's it going?
It's going well, man. How are you?
I'm good. We're doing The Elephant Man today, which is David Lynch's 1980 film about Joseph Merrick, who was a
Or
late
John,
18th
as he's
century,
called
or
in
John,
the
as he's, yeah, exactly. He's a late 18th century figure.
Is it 18th or
in
19th?
Britain. Or I guess it would be 19th century,
It was
right?
19th, right? I always
1800s,
get that
19th,
confused
yeah.
too, but we're talking, I think
You
he
go
was
back
born,
one for centuries.
Yeah. He was born in what, I think like 1862.
Yeah.
Died, I think, in about 1880, or I'm sorry, 1890. So yeah, I think that's going to actually have him in the 19th century London.
Yes,
Yeah.
late 19th century. But yes, he was known as the Elephant Man. He had severe deformities to his body.
Which we still don't medically understand
Yeah,
exactly.
we don't. There's theories as to what they could have been, but yeah, there's no consensus really on what exactly was the cause of it.
Yeah, they've even done, I think, a DNA test of bone and hair.
His remains are still on display in London, I think. Yeah.
Still no consensus as to exactly what he might have been afflicted with, but very interesting case.
Yeah, very interesting figure. So the movie is primarily based off of Treves' book, who was the doctor, Sir
Frederick Treves. Yep.
Frederick Treves, yeah, who was basically his I suppose you could say closest friend and
benefactor, doctor.
But
Frederick Treves' book, The Elephant Man and Other Reminiscences, I think was the primary source, although I think there was an additional source as well, if I'm not mistaken, but that was the primary source for Lynch.
There was the other was a book. I think it was a researcher was the other.
Correct. It was
not a primary source. Yeah.
Ashley Montague's The Elephant Man: A Study in Human Dignity, which was released in 1971. So those were the two source materials.
Yeah, and it was produced by Mel Brooks, uncredited. But he thought that he felt that his name being on the movie would kind of lead people to assume that it was satire or comedy of some sort, and so he decided to take his name off the movie. But yeah, Mel Brooks involved, which is interesting because just kind of, I guess, an aside, that Lynch's previous film was in black and white. Was Eraserhead, and Mel Brooks's earlier film, Young Frankenstein, was black and white as well. So I find it interesting that this even mid 70s, early 80s, these movies are still being made in black and white on the name of the film stock. What was the film? It was a beautiful film stock.
So yeah, a fun little tidbit of history and trivia here. So I find the film to be really quite beautiful, and so I wanted to know what stock it was shot on. It was actually shot on Eastman Kodak's Plus X 5231. And used to be a very popular film for black and white, and there was a still 35 equivalent, and I'm not quite sure if that film is still made or not by the UK subsidy of Kodak that still makes film. I'd have to double check on that.
But, yeah, I'm pretty sure a whole bunch of them are discontinued. That they don't make
unfortunately,
anymore.
Some live on as still photo stock now. But this is for sure gone. So they discontinued this particular stock, and actually, interesting story. So I think we all remember that film, The Artist. Not too long ago, shot black and white.
One Best Picture.
I forget the year that was
2012,
released.
I think.
Okay, yeah.
Or 11.
Ish, yeah, ish. So actually the director of that film wanted to shoot on this stock, the Eastman Kodak Plus X 5231, wanted to shoot on that, but it had been discontinued by that point in time. So they were looking for, okay, do we have any stock that's, anywhere around the world? And it had literally just been snagged up. All of the little snippets, loose ends, everything that existed anywhere, reel here, reel there, was picked up by a project called The Ghastly Love of Johnny X, a film that I'm sure none of us have seen. I had never heard of it.
It's like a musical, I think. I looked up a trailer for it.
But it was made by an indie filmmaker out here in Burbank. So that project had actually bought up all the remaining stock right before the artist wanted to use it. And so the artist actually ended, if I'm not mistaken, they ended up shooting color digitally and then switched to black and white after the fact, if I'm not mistaken. So, which a lot of projects have done since then. But yeah, so it's gone.
Well, so what's interesting too about the film looks like it was shot in the early 20th century. Like it really does look like something from the 1920s or 30s.
Yeah. It really does have an old look.
And there's very clearly an intent and a choice being made there, and which is, I think, is really funny because, again, we kind of have spoken about this before, but movies didn't look like this in 1980, and I think that's a really important point to perhaps younger people who might watch this movie for the first time or something. That this very much looks. Is intentionally looking.
It's very
dated.
unique.
It looks like it's shot period. In a lot of ways.
And definitely the obviously black and white is part of that, but it was shot in other using other techniques and other ways that I think make it look even older. Which we could.
I would say the only one that is not, which is an interesting choice again, is that it's shot widescreen. Anamorphic, which is kind of an interesting choice to be made, like rather than perhaps 1:3 or Academy ratio, but regardless of that, it's still a beautiful movie. It's a really
That's a good point. I mean, especially because this is all interiors. We're in small rooms. We're in it. Not to say that I'm necessarily a fan of 4:3 or square films, but I think if there were a film where that would work. Frankly, this was a film that would have worked in. So I agree. Yeah. It's interesting that he went anamorphic widescreen. But I want to real quickly, before we jump into the cinematography of this film in earnest, a couple of the things that I think were really interesting on the history of it. So when this film was released in 80, like you said, Colin, it was its look was quite unique. Films were not looking like this in 1980. I mean, just to give us a little bit of contrast here. I mean, The Empire Strikes Back was the #1 box office film at the time. So, you have other films like 9 to 5, Stir Crazy with Richard Pryor, Airplane. I don't know if you've ever seen that comedy, the slapstick. I mean, so substantially different in look and feel and, production. Yeah. But the film was really quite successful. Up until this point, we have David Lynch. I'm sure we mentioned he was the director, right? We mentioned that already.
Yes, yeah.
Only his second film, and his previous film was Eraserhead, and that's quite a surreal. I mean, you could definitely call that an art house film. A very surreal experience. By no means, although it did actually do pretty well financially. I think you looked that up.
Yeah, it was made on 10,000 and made like 7 million, I think, over
which
3
is
years
amazing. I would have never guessed that. But to have such a successful sophomore effort, I mean, this film budgeted was about 5 million. It recouped that and more, 26 million at the box office just in North America. I know it was also popular in other countries. I think in Japan it was quite popular, other countries for sure. And it was nominated with 8 Academy Awards, including, I mean, big ones, Best Picture, Best Director, Best Adapted Screenplay, Best Actor. Now, unfortunately, it didn't win any. It lost all of those to Ordinary People, Raging Bull.
And it also spawned the Academy Award for Best Makeup. It was the inspiration. The next year they brought that on board because so many people were saying basically that we got to start acknowledging the incredible work that makeup artists do.
I feel so sorry for that production though. It's like, darn it, you do all this great work. And, so much so that the Academy is like, catalyzed and created a new category. And it's like, oh, not until next year.
yeah, exactly.
It's like, that's got to be a bittersweet moment,
Yeah.
But yeah, so let's go back to a little bit of what you were talking about, the look and the feel of this film. I think it is really unique. And I totally agree with you. I feel like this film has... it absolutely has a look that's so much older than 1980. Yeah. I mean, it almost feels, it feels period, not just in the costume, in the location, in the language, in the subject matter, but I mean, this really feels like an old film, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I think that's something that I think was very much an intention was shooting this movie as it would have been shot. Of course, cinema didn't exist when Merrick was around, but shooting this as it would have been shot then, and kind of taking the cues on theater, especially, and things like that. Even just from the point that the camera is very, very observational. It's very much, obviously, of course, on a tripod the entire time. Just kind of pans to follow action, zooms in on a lot of things, but doesn't really push in. There's not really any dollies. There's not much movement of the camera in an actual like 3D movement kind of sense. It really is a very simplified production, and because of that, again, it sort of does feel like almost like a little bit of an expressionistic. It feels very much like a kind of an early silent film in a lot of ways, which I thought was really, really neat. And even adding to that too. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say. You said expression. I was going to say, I do get a feel of like some German expressionism. I get like little hints of for example, and the high contrast way it's shot. You even sometimes feel even a little bit of noir creep in. A lot of like I said, high contrast lighting. A lot of like the usage of shadows to hide and reveal. So I definitely noticed that too. But I'm sorry to continue.
No, I was just going to add too that it also, to me, like there's a lot of inspiration from, and again, this is all, me kind of stipulating or not stipulating. I'm just speculating on things that we've seen, but I think there's a lot of that sort of feels almost like an old like Creature of the Black Lagoon as well, and that it almost presents and not in in a very, very aware way, that it's kind of like approaching the subject matter to a degree that the people at the time would have approached him, because of course he was kind of paraded around circuses and things like that.
It feels like a MGM monster movie.
Yeah, so it does.
Especially
it definitely presents
that first act. Yeah.
And so I know another thing too. So the movies, of course, being with that being the visual interpretation of the movie, I would also add that the storytelling very much feels rooted in that exact kind of aesthetic, or that kind of time period.
Yeah.
In that it's very simple. There's not a whole lot of opinion being put onto the material. There's not a whole lot of necessarily point of view. Again, it's very much a movie that seems to be much more in a Herzog sense, fly on the wall than like kind of a stinging horn. It doesn't really say any or like bring any grand conclusions to the table and say like this is what you have to think about leaving this movie. It's very much presented again in that very simplistic kind of like, the reason that I think it's so interesting to compare it to like a Creature of the Black Lagoon or something like that is because to me it almost seems like it's the Creature of the Black Lagoon if the filmmaker now had sympathy for the Creature of the Black Lagoon.
And of course, like that's Frankenstein, of course.
Yeah,
which
Frankenstein
is
too. Yeah,
right.
Yeah, and so I think that it's interesting that it's made in that way and that it's presented in that kind of format, without going the kind of extra step of contextualizing it in a modern day context. Like it doesn't really have, I would say, a modern point of view on the subject matter. There's no critiques really that are brought up of the treatment of him by any characters,
well,
whether
it's super interesting that it's extremely interesting you mentioned that, because it is, the film very much is, and we're definitely going to get into this kind of the Lynch's opinion, his perspective, and moralization or lack thereof. We definitely want to talk to you a lot more about that, but I want to focus in for just a moment here on part of what you mentioned, because you said a lot there about this, that the story is told not just in its look and in the feel from it, it's you're right in how they handle the subject matter. It feels like the story is being told from the perspective of 1880, right? It's almost as if we made this film right after Joseph Merrick died, like this might be what that film would look like. Is kind of, so it's like if we made this film 100 years prior to when it was made. And a great example of I think is the very opening. The very opening of this film, we have this great surreal, symbolic, very
Lynchian.
Very Lynchian.
The most Lynchian part of the movie, arguably. Yeah.
There's a couple of these dream sequences, right, that I feel are very much Lynchian. But what we have here is, and it's really unsettling. It's quite disturbing. This, it almost it feels almost like that a woman is being either hurt or accosted by this elephant. But it's interesting to note, that was the explanation back then of what had happened to Joseph Merrick. The explanation at the time was, of course, lacking modern medicine and technology, was that she had been injured by an elephant while she was pregnant. And that encounter with that elephant while she was pregnant imprinted this onto the infant. And that was a common belief at the time. That was a commonly held medical belief that if something happened to a pregnant woman like that, if she were frightened by an animal or, some kind of event like that occurred, that it would imprint that onto the infant and potentially affect their development. So it's interesting that, Lynch shows us this happening and basically is the explanation. This is the explanation in the film for why Joseph Merrick is the way he is to an extent. So it's very much told from this perspective that's 100 plus years old. So I think that's quite fascinating because, of course, you could have made the choice to tell the story in an entirely different way. I mean, you could have told it from a today's perspective, right, if you wanted. Something else I noticed too, just real quick, that really places this film in that era is there's so many, I guess, inserts, if you want to kind of call it that, of machinery. There's a lot of machinery and smokestacks, and they don't seem to necessarily have anything to do with the story per se. But I feel like it really puts you in this time period of industrialization in London.
Yeah, and even the opening scene of the film is, well, not necessarily the very opening, but one of the opening scenes, our introduction to Anthony Hopkins' character, is him doing surgery on someone who's been injured by machinery. So, and even then, perhaps that could be, again, all speculation, but perhaps the connection that Lynch was trying to make there was somehow that this pollution could have caused, birth deformities, as has been recorded through history of areas of extreme pollution, of extreme, chemical output, often wind up with more and more birth defects, a higher rate of birth. So whether or not that was the intention, who knows? It could have it could have simply just been something to establish the time period and establish the feeling. But I would say that it is definitely, again, like you were saying, that there's this very interesting kind of, especially in the first half of the movie, this motif of machinery continually coming up, and that Hopkins, one of his lines is basically about the uncaring, unfeeling, almost primitiveness of machines and things like that. And he's very critical of them. So I think it is interesting, and perhaps that even does come up again, very, very vague connection, or subtle. But the idea perhaps that it is this machine instinct that makes people fear Merrick. That's a great... the immediate response for most people is this, again, this very almost like computational fear without any reason to be fearful other than purely on a visual level. Right. And so I think that is kind of interesting. And again, like I don't have the answer to what Lynch was necessarily going for in his specific choices there, but I would say that it is interesting that those things do come up a lot, especially within the first half of the film when Merrick is being introduced, before it's 45 minutes before he has his first line of dialogue in this movie. So the first half of the movie very much is portraying Merrick as this voiceless creature. Right. Doesn't look like a human. Like, he doesn't have a human being's face. He doesn't have,
or shape, hardly
body or shape or anything. You see him in silhouette when he's, you don't really get a lot of close-up views of him until he begins to talk. And I think that that's, again, a very deliberate choice, that he is portrayed as this thing that cannot be seen, this almost like an enigma of mankind, and that this creature. And that it's once he begins to speak and kind of is humanized in that way, that we then tone all of that down. There's no longer the stark images of silhouette with him. There's no longer the long, again, Universal monster movie type shots of him kind of stumbling down a dark hallway. It becomes very much a much more matter-of-fact type of filmmaking once he's introduced as more so a person, if that makes sense. And I think that does really hark on the idea that it was made exactly like you said. It was made like something in the 1890s. Because this day and age, I mean, let's speculate for a second. This day and age, if this movie was made, I think that it would humanize Merrick from the outset. I think that it would be much more of a story from his point of view, from his perspective. You would feel what he was feeling much more viscerally. It would perhaps discuss more so about his aspirations and much more about I think it would do much more to put you in the shoes of the character in this horrifying just situation that he was in, where every single person he seemed to see was terrified of him, and how horrible that would be for somebody, which this movie of course does touch on, the Lynch version does touch on. But I think that this day and age, if this movie was made from a modern context, that would be much more at the forefront of the film, which I think is very interesting, because again, Lynch chooses to strip all that away and make it very much something that's quite matter of fact, that is quite almost theatrical in a lot of ways. So I just think that's an interesting choice that Lynch decided on, was this idea that, it's not super personal, if that makes sense. Like, it doesn't, although it's about Merrick himself, it doesn't feel like it's a very personal picture about Merrick. It feels much more biographical, much more of a study of the man than himself, than like his, necessarily a movie about him and his wants and dreams and things like that. So I just think that's kind of an interesting angle that the movie came from.
Well, there's a lot there. You brought up a lot of different things. I think, in my mind, so try to touch on a handful of things that you brought up. So I think, Lynch is kind of taking us through the process that anybody who would have been introduced to Joseph Merrick in life would have gone through. Mm-hmm. And it's the process that Frederick Treves, Hopkins' character, goes through, and so many of the other, frankly, almost all the characters go through this process with him, which is that on your initial impression, he is not human. He is a curiosity. He is terrifying. He is gruesome. And you're trying to understand and process what this thing is. And so the way he's revealed to us is absolutely in that way. We're also curious. We're no different than these other characters who find him as a gruesome novelty, and we're more concerned about our curiosity than we are about his feelings. Mm-hmm. And so it's only after this process of realization that the characters go through as well, and we're going through it with them, where he's humanized, right? The film mm-hmm. humanizes him over time. So he starts out at one point where he is definitely something other than human. And by the time we empathize greatly with him, because we see that he has an intellect, he has feelings, he is hurt by the reactions of other people to his physical appearance, and we see this, and we get to know him a little bit more. And so I think, the film is allowing us to go through a process that I think anybody would have gone through.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's the sad reality of it, is that I think that most people would not. I mean, this is the reality of humans, period. Whether you look like the Elephant Man or you look like anybody else, a lot of times we don't empathize with things that we don't, people that we don't have some kind of personal extended experience with, sadly. Mm-hmm. And this is, this leads to a lot of nasty things in our world. But, most of the time, this is how racism exists. This is how sexism exists. This is how all kinds of things exist, where you've dehumanized a group of people or a person until you actually get to know them. And once you get to know them, and then you actually start to see them as human. So mm-hmm. in my mind, I think this is a really interesting mechanism. I think I like the choice by
I think
Lynch.
It's very,
But you do, other things that you touch on too. I mean, there's so much here. I'm afraid I don't want to lose some of the other things you talked about. But, you talked about a difference between this film and how a biographical film would have been done today. And I think maybe you and I have talked about this a little bit, but I'm not a big fan of how most biograph films are done today.
Yes,
I'm really not a fan. And a lot of this Oscar bait stuff that's been put out, and clearly this was Oscar bait too, although they didn't bite. Ha ha ha. But it's it's interesting too. Boy, I mean, we could really go into this for a long time here, but in a strange sense, you could make an argument, and I don't know if I am, but I'm just going to kind of present it as food for thought. That Lynch is kind of doing to the Elephant Man what he's pointing out that other people did in his lifetime, which is that it's kind of like he's still reduced to his physical attributes in this film in a sense. I mean, he is still defined by his deformities and by how other people react to his deformities in this film. We aren't, although we do get some glimpses, right? We into Merrick, but very little. We get little moments where we sense a longing to be loved by a woman. We get some of that. And there's that really kind of nice, beautiful, touching scene where he's reenacting Romeo and Juliet. But this man is presented so one-dimensionally. We don't see anything, for example, that he's a real human being with also less desirable traits. We see that he
never gets angry. Yeah,
he never gets angry. He never gets jealous. I mean, do you think maybe the Elephant Man might have been resentful in real life, jealous maybe in real life of people who looked normal? I'm going to guess likely, because he's human. So a lot of these biograph films strip that humanity away from people, from their subjects, because I think they're afraid.
They make it all about the struggle. Yeah.
I think they're afraid that it's like, well, if we admit that he was human and that he also had traits that we consider quote unquote unpleasant, that somehow this takes away our ability to like use him as an icon of the triumph of the human spirit. And I'm like, that kind of stuff just bores me.
Well, I also think that it's very, like, when you say that he's still in this film presented relatively one-dimensionally, that most people in this movie are as well. There's a lot of interesting. So this kind of goes into the choices of I'm not sure if it was Lynch or if it was the other writers that decided these things, but what's interesting about this film is that there's a lot of the changes that are made from real life. For example, that the real life relationship between Merrick and Treves was much longer than it's kind of presented in the movie. They had a relationship for years. But even so Tom Norman, who is the person that bites, who is the kind of circus owner that parades Merrick around at the beginning of the film. In the film, he's presented as this kind of like a working class, not very rich, not a very good life, kind of a piece of
scoundrel,
crap, a scoundrel,
a con man and a scoundrel.
In real life, that the real Tom Norman only knew Merrick for a matter of weeks before Merrick was kind of taken to the hospital, and was actually quite a wealthy man. Was quite a successful businessman in London who owned a whole bunch of these, as they were called, freak shows.
Right.
And so it's interesting that choice, but it's also something to be said that pretty much everybody of the working class in this film is presented as sort of animalistic, sort of monstrous. Whereas everyone of the upper classes, there's still some moments where people of the upper classes are displayed as being scared or something of Merrick, but much more gentle. And it almost also, kind of in line with that, plays up this idea that Merrick isn't human until he can read and recite Shakespeare and recite the Bible. Like that there's this kind of... And so again, that could totally have been... And so I'm not necessarily pointing at the finger and saying that Lynch is saying that all poor people are monsters and all rich people are nice. But I think that and it could very much have been, again, this idea that Lynch was making this film from an 1890s perspective, which would very well have been the perspective at the time. That the uneducated poorer masses, they were too uneducated to appreciate Merrick. They were too uneducated to understand that he was a human being, whereas we of the upper class, we of the theater, we of the, the medical professions, we understood him as a person, and so we were much kinder to him. So again, whether or not, again, I don't know if Lynch was making that decision because of that, because he was actually trying to almost highlight that element, that the elements of Treves' book, where, it's primarily mostly rich people that are kind to Merrick versus the poorer people who are, again, much more aggressive, much more violent towards him. Yeah,
and I've not read the book, so I don't know. But yeah, I absolutely, it's clear what you mentioned. It is that the poor people are represented here, or middle underclass are represented as crude and rude and heartless. Whether that's, like you mentioned, bites, or it's the night porter at the hospital who takes advantage of Joseph and charges people to bring people into his room and ridicule him and, doing it for a laugh and a little bit of extra money. Mr. Bites, you mentioned, he's represented as an alcoholic, and although there's a little bit of texture there, there's Lynch hints a little bit that maybe there is an affection, but absolutely 99% of it. He's putting him in cages, he's beating him, he's, it's really quite horrific treatment. And you're right. And then all the upper class people are the people with means, the people with education. They're by and large very nice. I think the most, negative scene that we show with a rich person is where that couple comes in to have tea with Merrick after he's kind of been presented to the London, social class, and they're a little bit afraid of him, which is like, well, who wouldn't be, But they're never rude. They're certainly not what you would call mean or abusive. So I agree. This is really interesting here. And it is, I think, as a whole, it's sometimes difficult to kind of understand what Lynch is saying. And I don't think Lynch is a director that some directors are very overt in their perspective in films, that in other words, they tell you exactly what they're thinking, whether it's through dialogue. They're very, very specific, and people have different opinions. It was definitely a criticism, I think, at the time. Roger Ebert did not review this film well and criticized kind of that he was unable to tell what Lynch was saying about this situation.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing necessarily. I think in some ways Lynch definitely hints at what he's saying about it, but I think he does it in a much more subtle manner, which I actually do prefer.
Totally. Yeah.
I really, really, really don't like those films where here's what you should think and here's why you should think it, and I just don't like. I don't like when ideology overtakes aesthetics in film in general, or art. Period. I'm not a big fan of that. So I prefer this. But he definitely, for example, Lynch, it's we are very clearly see a correlation where Joseph Merrick is being treated as an object or an animal and is on display at the freak show. But then again, the instant that Anthony Hopkins' character Treves brings him to the hospital and presents him, he's shown that he's totally degraded and treated as a non-human entity in front of in that theater with the other surgeons and doctors. And, and they really make it a point. Lynch very specifically makes a point to speak to the level of degradation, I think, and really, I think other directors or a lot of people would handle this in a less interesting way. But there was something like so poignant about even, as Anthony Hopkins is like describing that his genitalia are still intact. And it's like, remove your that last little bit of dignity and cover that you have and take away the cloth, and we don't see any of it. It's so beautifully done with his shadow silhouetted, behind that curtain. But it's just like to just take someone down to such a
he's being displayed once more,
objectified level. So I think Lynch is saying there, look, or at least he's asking the question: is there a difference? And of course he does have Treves' character explicitly say, I don't know if I'm doing this altruistically or am I just doing the exact same thing that everybody else is doing. At least he's asking the question, which I think is a good thing. And I think we've all asked ourselves those questions. It brings up an interesting kind of question of greed versus altruism. And we likely often delude ourselves into thinking we're being altruistic when we aren't. But yeah, what do you think overall?
I think what's interesting about what you've said is that I think what Lynch did, and again, this might be owing to the fact that he's portraying this story in a much more classical sense, is that he did, which all movies have to do. He simplified.
Yeah.
He took things from real life and put things on. So was the character, of course, Bites' real name, Mr. Bites in the movie, who's the guy that owns the circus. His real name, of course, again, was Tom Norman. Was in real life Tom Norman a man that beat him? We don't know. Tom Norman says that, in Tom Norman's autobiography, he says that he treated Merrick kindly, that Merrick often returned to him on his own accord and basically said that he felt like he was being shown as an animal in this hospital.
Interesting.
And at the time as well, like things like freak shows and stuff like that were really going out of style, that the general population just began to feel an empathy for these people that were being displayed as these freaks. So I think in a lot of ways what Lynch has done, and especially by changing his name, and I think that's, again, another thing that's intentional, is basically using this character to represent the parts of society that would still have this person be put on display like this. And then using that to represent, in contrast, Treeves's kind of more compassionate side. I think that he's simplifying it down because a story like this sort of needs to be simplified because, again, this took place in real life over the better course of a decade.
Yeah.
It could have been that for the first 3 years, Treeves didn't feel much sympathy for him, that Treeves was simply looking at him as a medical study, and that as he began to know him more and more and that relationship formed, that's when they became friends. That's when Treeves began to actually, appreciate his personhood.
Yeah.
But for the sake of the movie, which again, it's never really specified in the movie how long it takes place over, but it seems like it takes place over perhaps a few weeks or a few months.
It's brief. It seems brief. Yeah.
You just need to rush those things along. Essentially, you can't necessarily have too much time of Treeves, contemplating what he's doing, because otherwise you would spend half the movie doing that.
We'd have a Netflix series, basically.
Exactly. The movie's only a little bit over 2 hours.
Yeah, and this is true. Like, what you're saying is absolutely true. And it is one of the interesting challenges of film is, and I think especially with a biograph film where you're trying to represent, this life in an hour and a half or 2 hours time. So totally. I mean, it's very understandable. I think sometimes it's unfortunate that we lose some of the nuance. But I mean, then the other side of it though is that you look at this and you're like, it's almost kind of like a fairy tale story. This is almost like a Grimm's, right? It's reduced to such a kind of, you know what I'm saying? That it's like, we're really at this point, the Elephant Man, we're no longer talking about a human being. We're not really trying to understand Joseph Merrick per se. It's this entity is being turned into a symbol,
or a lesson,
or a lesson. And for example, I mean, one of the things that I felt, at least, and I'm curious to hear how it kind of personally impacted you, but we can move a little bit into that because I think that's one of the more interesting things to discuss with people. I always love to hear like what their personal experience with the film was, but for me, I mean, the way I felt about the film when I'm watching it is that I feel like all of us, or at least me, but I would guess that all or most of us, if we're really honest with ourselves, feel like we have an Elephant Man inside of us. I think that, I think everybody could probably at some point in time, greater or lesser degrees, but at one point in time have been ashamed about our bodies, about ourselves. There's something about us. We feel ugly. We feel like we're an outsider. We feel we're made fun of. Maybe you've been picked on when you were a kid in school, bullied. You're too fat. You're too short. You're too tall. Your teeth are crooked. You have acne. I mean, any number of things, right? But I think everybody goes through an experience of being ridiculed and embarrassed for our physical appearance, and it's something that most of the time it's like you can't help it. It's like I can't help it if I'm bald. I can't help it. I'm not, by the way, but but you can't help it if you're. I know I have. Like I have definitely been ashamed of my body, and felt shame for that, and I have felt what it is to feel like people are ridiculing you or judging you or being critical that you don't fit. So I think most of us feel like that. And it really doesn't necessarily have anything to do with your exterior body. A lot of times, maybe people aren't even noticing or don't care, but it's the insecurity that we all have about ourselves, how we all want to fit in, and even more. I mean, I think most of us want to be beautiful. We long to be beautiful in some way, to some degree.
Perceived as beautiful, especially not only by ourselves but by others.
Yeah. Correct. And so, and it's something that we can't, to great extent, often control. I mean, the Elephant Man didn't ask for this. He didn't do anything to deserve it. It happened to him, and we all are like that. What we're brought into the world with is what it's like, this is what we have. We did, we can't change it a lot of times. I mean, yeah, it's like, we could, plastic surgery and all these things, but you get my overall gist. It's a fundamental part of the human condition. So that's how I related to the film. That, it's not so much about let's try to represent this person's life in a realistic way, in a nuanced way, but it's let's take this person's life and turn him into a symbol of something and kind of mythologize it so that it resonates with others. So what did you kind of feel? Did it resonate with you in that way?
No, totally. I mean, I think that one of the things this movie does incredibly well is you care so much about Merrick.
Yeah.
It is actually a really, really to me at least, a really emotionally powerful movie in that I was like as simple as the storytelling is, and perhaps owing to the simple storytelling, I felt, you relate to the character in a way. And I think it's actually interesting too, because the most recent, I think one of the most recent stage productions of The Elephant Man was starring Bradley Cooper, where they decided to actually not do any makeup.
Yeah.
And it was all entirely just a physical performance. And I think the reason they did that was likely because, much in line with what we're talking about, is that it's more so making a point about anybody perceived to be different goes through some version of this. And I think that everybody has a point in their life where they do think that they are different, or they do feel different in some way. And so I think that's one thing that I thought was really remarkable. And even just the idea, again, like, was the Elephant Man ever chased through a train station? Who knows? But the moment when he's backed into that corner in the washroom and he screams out, I'm not an animal, I'm a human being, arguably the most famous scene from the movie. I think that it just resonates with every single person, because the whole point is that everybody wants a point where they can, or has a point in life where they feel like they need to say that. And I think that, on the kind of same note, the movie really does deal with, although as we spoke about before, how it's like very much divided by class, it does also very much deal with this idea of like internal and external beauty, which is that, that Merrick is such, and I think that might again be one of the reasons that Merrick is simplified to this man who's never angry, who's never jealous, who never lies, that is because it less so is trying to make an accurate portrayal of the man and of the story of the man and stuff like that, but more so using, like you said, the man as a symbol to represent that you can be someone with severe deformities on your outside, you can be someone that hardly looks human, and yet you're the most gentle, kind, loving, caring person in the world. And so, even again, just to talk a little bit about John Hurt for a second, that the performance that he gives through all this makeup is remarkable. We haven't even talked about that hardly. How soft-spoken he is, and how much sympathy he elicits from this. Like, you immediately just kind of want to give the guy a hug, which is what I thought was really remarkable about the movie. Like, the first thing you want to do is just get him out of there and be like, no, for God's sakes, how different would his life have been if he was around today. And so I think that's one of those
better.
things.
Sometimes you wonder, though. Sometimes I wonder.
Yeah. But I think that's the thing, is that you see this movie, and again, it becomes very much a point of, to me, it's like, again, it's probably just built into the source material automatically, whether or not it was a point to be made in the movie, but very much so that there's this huge point about, like, that the people who you don't like aren't the people who aren't physically pretty, it's the people who are abusive, manipulative, who are scoffing and aggressive and violent towards Merrick, not Merrick himself, of course. So
well, it's interesting. I mean, and so you're right. This is definitely another. You've got internal and external beauty. You also have, what does it mean to be human? And a lot of movies. You have a lot of movies go into this realm, like Blade Runner, where what is a lot of times that's where it goes. In today's day and age, like in a science fiction, like what does it mean to be human?
It gets existential almost.
It gets kind of, but this is kind of the same question in a sense, just asked in a different kind of context. But what is it to be human? Is human your physical shape? Is human your recognizable face? Is human your opposable thumbs and 2 arms and 2 legs? And is that human, or is human your intellect? Is human your emotional response to things? So it's asking a lot of these same questions, and you touched on this briefly earlier, and I think worth discussing again a little bit is this. is this idea of literature being attached to humanity. And we've got several examples here that I think are so interesting. I mean, and when Merrick is brought into the hospital and Treves wants him to stay, but the governor of the hospital or the head manager of the hospital doesn't. So, and Treves kind of trains him to respond to some commands and teaches him a little bit of Psalm 23. Yeah, and the governor's not impressed at all. He's like, well, you could have taught a monkey. It doesn't say that verbatim, but kind of. He's like, you could have taught anything to kind of just repeat, what you practiced. So they leave, and as they're leaving, Merrick continues to recite the Psalm 23 well past what he had been taught by Treves. Yeah. This is an indication to the both of them that there is humanity there, and it's interesting that it is his ability to speak, his ability to read and comprehend literature is a big part of what starts to convince them that he is actually human. We have another great scene, and actually it's one of I think the best scenes of the film myself, is the Romeo and Juliet scene.
Yes, yeah.
Where he is reading Romeo. We have this actress character in the film is playing Juliet, and they're going back and forth with their lines, and kind of, they fall into this scene, and it's really touching. It's really quite beautiful, and it's another part where literature and his ability to comprehend it, to be a part of it, to understand it, is used to kind of create this connection to humanity. And it's really beautiful. And she kind of calls him, says that he is a Romeo, and it's really a beautiful and humanizing moment. And then, of course, when Merrick is dying on the bed, he's like, finally, for once in his life, he's lying down, and Tennyson's Nothing Will Die poem, his like this star field with his mother's face is kind of, we've got this kind of a dream sequence, I guess, or dying sequence, or however you might like to call it. We have kind of another piece of literature, and even Merrick attending the play, and that I guess this performance of literature is kind of the impetus for Joseph to say, I've lived. Yeah. And I'm going to because you could strongly make an argument. He knows he's going to die if he lays down. So it's like, I have finally lived.
It's interesting too there, because I think in real life, again, it wasn't really certain whether or not his death was intentional, that it could have, that the idea, I think the consensus that Treves came to was that it was an accident, that he just felt like he wanted to try lying down. So, and I think it's another example of Lynch simplifying something, much like Herzog talks about, but it's more so that what's the truth versus fact, right? Like it comes back to that whole conversation. And Lynch does kind of leave it a
little bit open. I mean, it's not like, and this is what's great. I mean, Lynch doesn't have Merrick saying, I've got to shuffle off this coil now that he hints to it a little, because we see Merrick signs the cathedral that he's been building, this little miniature cathedral. He signs it. So we do get a sense of punctuation, right? That he had, it's almost like his, death note, so to speak, right? He signs this cathedral. And but Lynch is still open. I mean, you could also read it as like he's had this wonderful evening. He's gotten to go to this play. He received an ovation. He was called out, and so he's wants to experience just a little bit more of the fullness of what it means to be human, and just the simple ability to be able to sleep like a normal human. Yeah, so you could, you could kind of sort of, there's like some nuance there.
And he looks over at the painting that's on his wall of the child sleeping in bed, and so that there's this again, this and that goes back, this desire of like, what does it actually mean to be human? Because he almost looks at it as a way of like, I would like to sleep like a normal human being. He mentions that earlier in the film as well. But this idea, that it's like, you're completely correct in that it both emphasizes this whole idea of literature, but I think it's a very well thought out movie in terms, like, I feel like what I think is so funny about Ebert really not liking it, and the points that Ebert makes about not liking it, is that I almost would think the opposite. Like, I think that this movie really knows what it wants to say, and that is almost to say little. It's almost to to present these ideas.
So maybe that Lynch did have a pretty strong, because we
that's again because I see a lot of I see a lot of choice. I see a lot of intention in the way that the story is told, in the way both visually and the actual storytelling that goes on. I see so much intention there that I think that it would be a safe guess to say that the things that go on in the film, the way that things are kind of left to a much more ambiguous end, is very much intentional. That it's not an oversight. It's
so maybe there is
writing.
a strong voice here. It's just not a voice that is telling you what to think or how to think or why to think that way, like a lot of films are today.
Mm-hmm. It's more so just
a different
presenting
type of voice.
Yes.
Yeah. It's a different type of voice. Well, and it's a voice that I really appreciate.
No, totally. And I mean, I guess just to put it clearly, the guy, I really enjoyed them. It was my first time watching this movie, actually. I hadn't seen it before, whereas I think you mentioned that you'd seen it.
Well, we could kind of just end a little bit on, just in the most funny story, we can kind of wrap up my experience with it. So obviously I'm older than you. For those who haven't heard that before, there's about a 28-year difference between the two of us. I'm in my mid-40s, and Cullen is in his 20s. So I was 4 when this film came out. Obviously, I didn't go see it at the theater, but a year or 2 years later, whatever it was, when it finally came on cable, I caught some of this film, and it has left an absolutely indelible mark in my mind. It's burned into my brain. It scared the bejesus out of me. That back then, the way you watched movies was that you flipped around on channels, and whatever was on was what was on, and that's what you watched. So it was a very different experience. So, I was probably, let's say maybe 6 or so, maybe, and 6, 7 years old. And I'm flipping around, and the movie is starting, and it's this first, where Treves is kind of snaking his way through the back alleys with the barkers and everything. And on that first reveal of the Elephant Man, I was terrified. I was terrified. And I loved monster movies and science fiction movies and, all this kind of stuff, and horror movies even. Probably just starting to get into a little bit of that at only 6, but it really terrified me. But it also totally had me spellbound. I was so intrigued. I almost kind of even became obsessed with the Elephant Man. Like, I remember, going to the library and trying to read up on everything that I could find, what caused this condition, what in the world would do, like, what could make this happen to someone, and even like reading medical books. And I got really into it, man, when I was a kid.
Which is interesting,
So it had a big impact on me. That was kind of like this movie popped into my head as an option for us to do, because it was. I try to think back, like, just what were some of the films that had the most raw kind of visceral impact on me. And that was one of them, and I think when you take all of these things together, the black and white photography, the way it was shot lends it this ancient kind of feel, but yet we have such an accomplished makeup, done work there. The Elephant Man's prosthetic work, all of that makeup is outstanding. And it just felt so real. It felt like almost a documentary to me. It felt like, World War II, like documentary footage or something that had been shot, in 16 millimeter or something, but it really was extraordinary. So, my experience was that it was a pretty big deal when I was a kid. Now, I hadn't seen it in a really long time. So I'd say it's probably been 15 years since I'd seen the film. So it was great to come back to it now. But I very much enjoyed it. And I thought it was a pretty powerful experience. And it sounds like you did too on your first
viewing. I knew about I knew the story. I knew about it. I knew the big moment of the I'm not an animal.
Right.
That's very much something I've seen several times. And but I think what was interesting was going into it, I didn't really know what to expect, because I didn't know if it was going to be very Lynch in the way that it was going to be surreal. It was going to be sort of a little bit more art house, because I would say 99% of Lynch's movies are. If anything, this may be the kind of sole exception of his filmography that's not
pretty straight shot,
super dreamlike. Yeah, of course there are those moments in it that go surreal, but they're supposed to be dreams, so it makes sense within the context. But no, I loved it. It was one of those movies that, like, I'm a fan of David Lynch, so I had the expectation that I would have liked it going into it. But no, I thought that it was, I don't know, it kind of just encapsulated me. It took me away with it. There was never a moment where I felt myself drifting from the screen. There was a constant kind of attention throughout, which isn't super difficult. Like, I mean, I find it quite easy to watch very long movies. I'm not someone who struggles with that in any way, but no, this movie kept me engaged right throughout, and again, also made me feel a lot. Really, again, is a very emotional movie, and a very touching movie, and So I, for the first time watching,
thumbs up from Cullen.
Very happy with it. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, I'm glad that you enjoyed it. It's fun for me to kind of share films, and it's not very often that a film that had this big of an impact is something that you can share new with someone. So that's excellent. Yeah. I'm glad to hear that you enjoyed it.
What's fun too is that it's related vaguely to the last episode we did on Silence of the Lambs, because Jonathan Demme, apparently one of the big reasons that he wanted Hopkins to be Lecter was because of the Elephant Man. So
I love it. A great little tie-in. We'll try to do that. Like the next film that we pick for next episode, we'll try to find, a degree, just a degree of separation from one to the other.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, man. Well, on that note, we'll go ahead and sign off. But it's been yet another awesome conversation. It's always a blast to discuss these films with you. I can't wait to see what we choose next time. I think you're going to be up for making a suggestion for what film we cover next time. So for our audience out there, that'll be a fun surprise. But everyone, thank you for listening. And until next time, have a great week.
Bye.